tonight, we're not chasing the noise of battles or the triumph of kings. Instead, we'll linger in a quieter corner of history, where the rhythm of daily life was slow, steady, and shaped by forces larger than any single person. These are the kinds of stories that don't clamor for attention, but hum softly in the background of time. Stories made of repetition, solitude, and patient endurance. Before we begin, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into forgotten places, a small gesture, liking this video and subscribing, helps keep them alive, drifting a little further into the world. And if you feel like it, leave a note in the comments with your location and the exact time you're listening. It's always striking to see how these small flickers of attention connect across oceans and continents. Each of you hearing this same story, quietly, together, though apart. Now, let us step into the stone walls of a tower that once stood at the edge of land and sea. The sea has always had a way of humbling those who live near it. Its expanse is endless, its moods impossible to predict, and its voice never falls silent. In the 19th century, before the world was tied together with radio signals, electric lights, and global shipping forecasts, the sea was even more mysterious than it is now. Sailors depended on instinct, skill, and the faintest guidance that might keep them from wrecking on unseen rocks. That guidance often came from a lonely tower standing against the horizon, the lighthouse. A lighthouse was not simply a building, it was a statement carved out of necessity. Stone by stone, iron by iron, these towers rose along treacherous coasts where ships had been lost too many times. They stood in places where the land met the sea with cruelty, jagged cliffs, hidden reefs, shifting sands. And while the tower itself might inspire awe from a distance, it was the human presence inside that gave it meaning. Without the keeper, the lantern would not be lit, the glass would not be cleaned, the mechanism would not be wound, and the tower would become nothing more than a hollow monument. The life of a lighthouse keeper was a paradox. It was a position of importance, for the safety of countless lives and fortunes depended upon the light being visible. Yet it was also a life of profound obscurity, carried out in solitude, with little recognition, on the edge of the world. To take on the post was to accept isolation, to agree to live where the cries of seabirds outnumbered the voices of people, where storms dictated your routine more than calendars ever could. The tower itself became a kind of companion, a silent partner in a daily rhythm of duty. Imagine approaching such a lighthouse for the first time. The journey there was rarely simple. Supplies had to be brought by boat if the station stood on an offshore rock, or by cart and horse over winding coastal paths if it was perched on a cliff. The tower would rise before you, stark against the shifting grey of the sky, its lantern room gleaming faintly even in daylight. Around it, the sound of waves would be unceasing, sometimes a gentle wash, sometimes the full roar of breakers slamming against stone. To most people, this sound was a reminder of danger, of nature's unpredictability. To the keeper, it was the constant backdrop of existence. The walls of the tower were thick, often several feet deep, built to withstand storms that could shake lesser buildings apart. From the outside, the lighthouse might look indestructible, but within those stone walls, the keeper lived a life that was anything but invulnerable. Every creak of the iron stairs, every groan of the timbers during a gale, was a reminder that the sea pressed hard against human effort, testing whether the light would hold against darkness. Inside, the air often smelled of oil and salt. The lantern room above contained the great lamp, fueled by whale oil in the early part of the century, later by kerosene. Its flame, magnified and focused by massive glass lenses, reached miles out into the night. But it was fragile too. A dirty lens, a wick trimmed poorly, a clockwork mechanism left unwound. Any of these could make the light falter, and if it faltered, ships might be lost. The keeper understood that his work was less about himself and more about unseen strangers sailing through the dark. He rarely met those he protected, but their lives brushed against his in the flicker of a flame. The lighthouse stood as a symbol of solitude, yet it was also a crucible of routine. The keeper had to tend to the tower as though it were a living thing. Windows had to be polished until not a speck remained to dull the beam. Walls had to be scrubbed of salt crust left by wind-driven spray. Metal fittings, always vulnerable to rust, had to be greased and tightened. And then there was the endless care of the lantern, the trimming of the wick, the topping up of oil, the constant vigilance to ensure the flame burned steady through every night. There was little glamour in such work. Yet in the quiet repetition of these tasks, the keeper found a rhythm that mirrored the sea itself, endless, ceaseless, and oddly comforting. To wake each day and hear the same sound of gulls, to climb the same stairs, to look out over the same water. This was not monotony so much as continuity. The lighthouse did not change quickly, and neither did the ocean. For someone who lived within its stone embrace, time became less a sequence of days and more a cycle of tides. Still, the lighthouse was not immune to loneliness. When storms raged for days on end, cutting off all contact with the outside world, the keeper might go weeks without speaking to another human. His voice might grow strange in his own ears, used so seldom. Letters from family or friends took months to arrive, and even when they did, the inked words could not soften the silence. The keeper learned to accept this solitude as part of his bargain with the sea. In exchange for safety given to others, he surrendered much of his own comfort. The setting of the lighthouse often heightened this sense of detachment. Some towers were built directly on rocky islets, little more than bare stones surrounded by water, with no trees, no grass, nothing but the seabirds nesting in the cracks. Others stood high on cliffs where the nearest village might be miles away, visible only on clear days. In either case, the keeper's world narrowed to the dimensions of the tower and the sweep of the horizon. Beyond that horizon lay commerce, politics, and the wider world. But here, at the lonely tower, those things felt very far away. Yet, in the stillness of that place, there was also a kind of clarity. The keeper could read the sea the way others read newspapers. He knew the difference between the sound of waves slapping gently at the rocks and the deep thunder of a storm building far offshore. He could tell the time of year by the flight of birds, by the quality of the wind, by the angle of the sun slipping into the waves. In his own way, he was less cut off from the world than most, for he lived in direct rhythm with the oldest forces on Earth. The tower itself held a presence that was both comforting and confining. Its spiral staircases wound upward like the coils of a shell, carrying the keeper to the lantern above. Each step was worn smooth by the constant climb. The rooms, though spare, carried the scent of oil lamps and sea-damp clothing. At night, when the storm rattled shutters and whistled through cracks, the keeper might feel the entire structure tremble. And yet the tower held. It always held. Its steadfastness became a kind of reassurance, proof that some things could endure against the endless motion of the sea. Visitors were rare. Perhaps once every few months, a supply boat would arrive if weather allowed, bringing barrels of oil, sacks of flour, perhaps a crate of preserved meat or dried fruit. These arrivals broke the monotony, but they were brief. The boat would leave, and once again the tower would settle into silence. The keeper's companions were often the seabirds nesting on the cliffs, their cries cutting through the wind, their wings flashing against grey skies. He grew accustomed to their presence, even speaking to them at times, though they never answered in anything but screeches. Despite the solitude, there was dignity in the role. The lighthouse keeper knew his work mattered, even if few ever thanked him for it. Every night that the lamp burned without faltering was a night when ships passed safely, guided by a steady light. In a world still ruled by wind and tide, where storms could drive even the strongest vessel into disaster, the assurance of a beacon was invaluable. The keeper stood at the boundary between safety and loss, holding his vigil not for glory, but because it had to be done. The lonely tower by the sea was, in many ways, a mirror of the keeper's life. It was tall and unyielding, but within it was a flicker of flame that had to be nurtured constantly. Without care, the light would vanish, and the tower would be nothing more than stone. Without vigilance, the keeper himself might fade into despair. Yet, by tending to the light, he also tended to himself, finding meaning in duty, purpose in solitude, and a strange peace in the endless company of waves. So the tower stood, year after year, its lamp sweeping across the dark waters. And within it, the keeper carried on, his life measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the steady rhythm of flame, wind, and sea. The arrival of a lighthouse keeper was rarely a grand affair. There were no cheering crowds, no welcoming banners, no songs of honor sung in his name. More often, his coming was quiet, almost hidden, as if the sea itself wanted to test his resolve before granting him a place on its edge. He might arrive in a small boat, its oars dipping steadily into the waves, or in a cart that rattled over a rough coastal road until the tower loomed into view. However he came, the approach marked a turning point in his life. Behind him lay the known world of towns and neighbors, of family voices and familiar streets. Ahead stood the stone tower, stern and waiting, as if it had always been there and would long outlast him. Imagine a man in his mid-30s, or perhaps older, carrying little more than a trunk with his belongings. He might wear a heavy coat, for the sea air cut cold even in summer, and sturdy boots fit for climbing wet rocks. His face, weathered already from years of labor or naval service, carried a look not of excitement but of quiet resignation. This was not a post chosen for pleasure. It was a duty accepted, often because steadier work was scarce, or because a man valued the wages, however modest, that came with the isolation. To keep a light burning was to earn bread for his family, even if it meant seeing them rarely. As the keeper first set eyes on the tower, he would feel its authority immediately. Its height was commanding, but it was not beauty that struck him. It was endurance. The walls stood against the sea as though daring it to break them. The lantern room at the top shone faintly, even in daylight, glass windows catching the sun in sharp glimmers. If the sea was restless, the waves hurled themselves against the base with a sound like thunder. To most, this would be an intimidating sight. To the keeper, it was a promise of what lay ahead. Long nights of vigilance, long days of labor, and the endless company of wind and water. Upon arrival, he would be shown the interior by the outgoing keeper, if there was one. Many lighthouses were manned by more than a single man, but there were also those lonely posts that required one figure only, marooned with his duties for weeks at a time. Stepping inside, he would be struck by the chill of the stone walls. The staircase spiraled upward in narrow coils, steep and unrelenting, a climb that he would soon come to know by heart. Each turn of the stairs revealed small, round rooms with little comfort, a bunk bed with coarse blankets, a wooden table scarred by years of use, shelves with ledgers and instruments, and perhaps a single chair positioned near a window slit to watch the horizon. It was not a home in the ordinary sense. The lighthouse was designed for function, not coziness. Every item had a purpose: tools for cleaning, brushes for lenses, cans for oil, wicks, ropes, pulleys, and spare parts for the mechanism that turned the great lamp. If a man longed for warmth or decoration, he would not find it here. The closest thing to ornament was the precision of the machinery itself, the careful gears, the shining brass, the heavy glass prisms that bent and magnified the light into a piercing beam. These were the treasures of the tower, and they demanded respect. The first task of a newly arrived keeper was to learn the rhythm of the place. The sea dictated much, but the lamp dictated more. Its flame could never be neglected. By day, it needed cleaning and preparation. By night, it demanded constant attention. The outgoing keeper, if one remained for a short handover, would instruct him on the rituals, how to trim the wick without smoking the glass, how to polish the lenses until they shone like crystal, how to wind the clockwork that turned the lamp so that its beams swept across the horizon in perfect intervals. The slightest mistake could mean a dimmed light, and a dimmed light could mean disaster. When the last formalities were over, and the new keeper was left alone, the silence of the tower pressed in. It was a silence that seemed deeper than elsewhere, as though the thick stone walls absorbed all sound but the sea. In that quiet, He could hear his own breathing, the ticking of the clockwork, the occasional drip of water seeping from unseen cracks. The absence of voices was sharp. For a man used to noise, the chatter of a tavern, the bustle of a market, this stillness could feel almost unnatural, yet soon it became a constant, as familiar as the sound of his own heartbeat. The keeper's first evening marked the true beginning of his service. As the sun sank, he climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room. The view from there was vast. The horizon stretched unbroken, a line where sea met sky in shifting shades of grey and gold. The air smelled of salt and oil, and the wind rattled against the glass panes. He set to work with careful movements, for clumsiness here could undo hours of preparation. The lamp was filled with oil, the wick trimmed and tested. When the final glimmer of daylight disappeared, he struck a flame and brought it to the lamp. The moment the wick caught, the tower came alive. Light swelled, magnified by the great lenses, and shot out across the darkening waters. It swept in slow arcs, a pulse of brightness that reached farther than his eyes could follow. For the first time, the keeper felt the full weight of his post. Somewhere, out there on the vast sea, sailors would glance toward the horizon and see the glow. They would not know his name, nor the labor behind that light. They would see only safety, a warning of rocks, a sign of land, a steady hand guiding them through the unknown. And he, alone in his stone tower, was the reason they saw it at all. As the night deepened, the keeper settled into his vigil. He checked the lamp, ensuring it burned evenly. He wiped condensation from the glass. He noted the time in a ledger, his handwriting uneven in the dim light. Every hour, he walked the narrow gallery that circled the lantern room, peering into the dark to make certain the beam was clear. He listened to the wind howl through cracks, to the sea gnash at the rocks below. He was watchman, caretaker, and solitary witness to the ocean's moods. When fatigue pressed on him, he resisted. Sleep could not come easily here, for if he dozed too long and the lamp faltered, the consequences could be fatal for others. Instead, he allowed his mind to wander quietly. He thought of his family, if he had one, far inland or in a village down the coast. He thought of sailors who might be watching the light, their ships creaking as they rode the swell. He thought of the keepers before him, men who had stood in this same tower, tended this same flame, and looked out on the same horizon. The lighthouse was older than he was, and it would remain when he was gone. He was only the latest in a long line of guardians. The dawn came slowly, a grey wash spreading across the sea until the first pale light touched the glass. With careful hands, he extinguished the lamp, shielding the wick from draughts until the flame vanished. The lantern room fell into stillness again, its mighty lenses dulled in the morning haze. Below, the sea rolled on as if nothing had changed. Yet he felt the weight of the night's work, the sense of having kept the darkness at bay for those who travelled it. Daytime in the lighthouse was no less demanding. The lamp had to be cleaned of soot and residue. The lenses had to be polished until they gleamed. Every gear and chain in the mechanism had to be inspected, lubricated, and tested. The stone floors were scrubbed, the metal fittings checked for rust, the logbooks updated with careful precision. The keeper's hands were never idle, for the sea corroded everything it touched, and without constant maintenance, the tower would soon fall into disrepair. Meals were simple affairs, often little more than bread, dried fish, or salted meat cooked on a small stove. He ate alone, seated at the wooden table, the light from a narrow window falling on his plate. The sound of the sea was always there, echoing even in the silence of the dining room. Afterward, he might walk briefly along the base of the tower, stretching his legs, though he never strayed far. The sea was beautiful, but it was also merciless, and he knew the dangers of careless footing on wet rocks. In time, the rhythm of this life became steady. The keeper rose with the sun, labored through the day, lit the lamp at dusk, and kept his vigil through the night. Each cycle blended into the next until days became indistinguishable from one another. Seasons, not dates, marked the passage of time, the softness of summer fog, the fury of winter storms, the sharp clarity of autumn skies. The tower, always the same, became a measure of his endurance. To arrive at such a post was not simply to take on a job. It was to step into another kind of existence, one pared down to essentials, where duty defined each hour. The keeper's arrival marked the beginning of a long relationship with the sea, a bond that was at once burdensome and profound. He was not merely living beside the ocean, he was living within its rhythm, answering its demands and surrendering to its solitude. The tower watched him as much as he watched it. Its stone walls seemed to absorb his footsteps, its narrow rooms to remember his presence. Every day, as he climbed the spiral stairs and tended the flame, he became more a part of it, until it was no longer possible to imagine one without the other. And so the keeper, having arrived at his post, began a life shaped entirely by the light he tended and the sea that surrounded him. The world beyond might change, politics, inventions, wars, but within the tower, the rhythm would remain the same. One man, one flame, and the endless watch of the horizon. The tower was more than a dwelling. It was a fortress against the sea, a monument to endurance, and a machine built for one purpose: to hold a light above the water. For the keeper who now lived inside it, the tower's character revealed itself in every step, every sound, every cold surface. The stone walls and iron stairs were not merely part of his surroundings. They were the frame of his existence, the architecture of his days and nights. The walls themselves had been laid with an unforgiving hand. In some lighthouses, they were 10 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rose, each stone set with the knowledge that storms would test it relentlessly. The sea hurled itself against those walls, waves shattering in sprays that flew upward like shattered glass. In winter, when ice formed in cracks and the wind drove the ocean sideways, the tower quivered but held. To the keeper, the walls were both protection and prison. They kept him alive, yet they also sealed him in, cutting him off from the softness of the world beyond. The stone was always cool to the touch, no matter the season. On humid summer days, when the air outside carried the scent of seaweed and salt, the interior still breathed chill air, as if the tower stored centuries of winter inside its bones. Moisture crept across the surfaces, leaving them damp and sometimes slick. Lanterns hung on brackets cast faint yellow pools of light, but the shadows clung to the walls as if reluctant to let go. In those moments, the keeper could sense how much life had been given to building such a structure. Masons laboring on high scaffolds, quarrymen cutting rock far inland, ships hauling blocks across treacherous waters just to set them in place. The tower was a feat of endurance before it ever became his refuge. The spiral staircase was the tower's spine, forged of iron and bolted deep into the stone. It wound upward in a tight coil from the lowest level to the lantern room above. Each step bore the imprint of countless boots before his own. They rang with a hollow metallic sound that echoed through the chamber like a subdued bell. The climb was endless and unchanging, and yet it became a rhythm of life, a daily ritual that shaped the keeper's body and mind. To ascend was to accept the weight of the tower. To descend was to return to its depths. There was a peculiar intimacy to the stairs. The keeper came to know every creak, every subtle vibration when the wind pressed hard against the tower. He knew the feel of the railing beneath his hand, worn smooth by years of touch, cold as the sea air that seeped in through cracks. In storms, the staircase swayed almost imperceptibly, a reminder that even the strongest structure yielded slightly to the elements. He trusted it all the same. Without the stairs, the tower was nothing but unreachable levels. With them, it became a living space, a vertical world he moved through each day. The rooms were narrow circles pressed into the walls of the tower, each one stacked above the other like compartments in a shell. At the bottom, storage for oil, tools, and provisions. Higher up, the living quarters. A bunk, a stove, a table, and little more. Higher still, the watchroom, where the keeper could rest briefly while keeping the lamp within reach. At the summit, the lantern room, the crown of the tower, with its glass walls and glittering prisms. The staircase bound them all together, reminding him with every climb that duty was never far away. Stone and iron might seem lifeless, but in the solitude of the lighthouse, they became companions. The walls spoke in low groans during storms. The stairs sang with every step, and the tower itself breathed with draughts and echoes. These sounds were not distractions, they were reassurance. They told the keeper that the tower still held, still performed its duty. Silence, true silence, would have been more frightening than the groan of stressed stone or the hiss of wind through cracks. At night, when the lamp burned above, the staircase became a path he walked in near darkness. Carrying oil up the stairs was laborious, each step weighted by the burden in his arms. The metal grated beneath his boots, and the shadows shifted with the glow of his lantern. He climbed slowly, steadily, knowing that haste might mean a stumble, and a stumble here could be fatal. Few places offered less forgiveness than a spiral staircase in a tower battered by the sea. The stone walls were his clock. They measured the passage of time, not by decoration or change, but by the slow accumulation of salt and damp. In the mornings, the light slanted through narrow windows, tracing pale arcs across the rough surface. By noon, the walls glowed faintly with the reflection of sunlight on water. At dusk, they turned dark again, swallowing the fading day. When storms pressed hard, water seeped through joints and left streaks of mineral crust that marked the years like faint scars. The keeper, walking past them daily, read these signs without words. Though they confined him, the walls also offered safety. Outside, the sea raged with a force that could shatter wooden ships into splinters. Yet within, the keeper stood unharmed. He could lean his back against the stone and feel the tower resist the storm. The sound was overwhelming at times. Waves crashing, wind shrieking, rain hammering the glass of the lantern room. But the structure never yielded. In those moments, he felt both small and secure. A single figure shielded by the endurance of human labor against the power of nature. The iron stairs tested him differently. They demanded physical strength and steady patience. To carry oil, to clean the lantern, to patrol the gallery, he had to climb and descend countless times each day. His legs ached, his breath shortened, yet the routine built him into a man as enduring as the stairs themselves. In the hush of night, when the sea murmured below, he could close his eyes and trace the steps in his mind, each rise and turn, etched into memory as clearly as if carved into stone. There were moments when the tower seemed to shrink around him, its walls pressing close, its stairs endless and confining. In those moments, solitude sharpened into something heavier. The keeper understood why some men broke under the strain, their minds worn thin by the unchanging spiral of stone and iron. But for him, the tower became a kind of anchor. In a world where the sea was always shifting, always restless, the tower remained steady. Its walls might dampen with spray, its stairs might echo in emptiness, but they endured. In their constancy, he found balance. Sometimes, when he paused midway up the staircase, he would rest his hand on the wall, feeling the cold stone beneath his palm. He thought of the builders who had set those stones decades before. Men who had never seen the lamp lit yet trusted their labor would protect ships for generations. He thought of the keepers before him, climbing these same stairs in storms and in calm, tending the same flame. The walls carried all their weight, the stairs echoed all their steps, and now he was simply one more voice in that long chorus of silence and duty. The spiral climb shaped his life as much as the sea did. He woke, knowing he would walk those stairs again and again, a daily pilgrimage from the depths of the tower to its crown. Each climb was not just movement, it was a reminder of why he was there. The flame at the top waited, and as long as it burned, the tower had meaning. In the end, the stone walls and iron stairs became inseparable from the keeper's sense of self. He was not apart from them, he was within them. bound by their strength and endurance. His life spiraled upward just as the staircase did, always circling, always rising toward the light. And when he stood at the lantern room, gazing out over the dark horizon, he knew the tower's strength was also his own. Above all else, the lighthouse was not built for the man who lived within its walls. It was not built for comfort, nor for shelter, nor for the sake of companionship. It was built for the flame. The lantern was the heart of the tower, the one element that mattered more than stone foundations or iron stairs, more than the keeper's health or his sanity. Everything revolved around it. It was a light that could never be allowed to rest. The 19th century keeper understood this with an almost religious clarity. His world was dictated not by the rising of the sun, but by the expectation that when darkness fell, the lantern would blaze against the blackness. It was not simply a matter of lighting a flame and walking away. The lens, the wick, the oil, the chimney, the glass, all demanded endless tending. In truth, the lighthouse keeper's life was a kind of servitude, not to the sea, not even to the government that paid him, but to the lantern that refused to sleep. At the top of the tower, the lamp room was a fragile sanctuary of brass and glass. The great Fresnel lens, imported from France or constructed by local craftsmen depending on the era, stood like a giant jewel, gathering and bending light into beams sharp enough to pierce miles of mist. It was an invention so advanced in its day that mariners considered it miraculous. Yet this miracle did not sustain itself. A single neglected wick could smoke, leaving soot to dull the brilliance of the lens. A smudge of oil on the glass could scatter the beam into weakness. A flame burning too low could falter in heavy weather. Each night, the keeper ascended those spiraling iron stairs, opened the door to the lantern room, and began the slow ritual of coaxing light into duty. The work began before sunset. Lamps had to be filled with oil, thick, pungent whale oil in the early part of the century, later replaced by colza, kerosene, or mineral oil when the whaling trade declined. Each gallon was carried up those twisting stairs in heavy brass or tin containers, arms aching, breath shallow in the close air of the stairwell. Spillage was dangerous, for oil meant fire, and fire meant the ruin of the tower itself. Still, the work had to be done, and it had to be done with care, for the reservoir must never run dry before dawn. The wick required trimming with scissors as precise as any surgeon's tool. Too long, and it would smoke. Too short, and it would sputter. The flame had to burn clear, steady, almost invisible in its perfection. The keeper would bend close, squinting, adjusting, wiping with cloths, polishing until the brass gleamed, the glass shone, and the lantern itself seemed to wait, poised like a caged animal. For the moment, darkness would demand its power. When the sun finally dropped beneath the horizon and the line of sea merged with the first shadows of night, the keeper struck his match. The small flicker flared into the trimmed wick, caught, steadied, and bloomed into flame. The Fresnel lens caught it immediately, magnifying, bending, spinning it outward in bright white beams that cut across the waves. To a sailor miles offshore, it was a promise of land, a warning of danger, a fixed point in a world of shifting blackness. To the keeper, it was the beginning of another long vigil, for though the lamp was lit, the work was not finished. The lantern was alive, and like all living things, it could fail. And when it failed, it demanded attention. The keeper kept his chair near the lamp, wrapped in a heavy coat, eyes half closed but never fully resting. Every hour, sometimes more, he checked the wick. He turned the mechanism that rotated the lens, a clockwork system weighted with iron that descended slowly down the tower shaft, requiring rewinding like a giant watch. He wiped away the faint smoke that gathered at the top of the chimney. He listened to the wind howl against the panes, watched rain streak across the glass, felt the shudder of the tower when the sea threw its weight against the base of the rocks. And always, he watched the light. There was fear in that watching. Not terror, not the raw panic of sudden danger, but a slow-burning fear that never left. If the light went out, ships could founder, men could die. The captain who cursed the dark horizon would not know of the keeper's fatigue. his oil running low, his flame choking in salt wind, there would only be wreckage and blame. The weight of that responsibility sat heavier than the gallons of oil carried up the stairs. The keeper lived under its pressure every single night, and there was no relief. Storms were the greatest trial. When the gales came, when rain lashed sideways, when fog swallowed the coast so completely that even the great lens could not break through more than a few yards of haze, the keeper's work became fevered. He trimmed the wick every few minutes. He adjusted the vents. He prayed that the oil would last until dawn. Some keepers told of nights where the storm raged so furiously that the glass panes themselves cracked or rattled loose, forcing desperate repairs in the midst of thunder and spray. Still, the lantern must burn. No excuse sufficed. Day brought no rest. Once the light was finally extinguished, once the flame was pinched and the lens ceased its revolution, another labor began. Cleaning. The soot of the night had to be scrubbed away. Brass fittings were polished. Glass was wiped until it shone like crystal. Any delay, any carelessness, would only worsen the work the following night. And so the cycle continued. Light at dusk, vigil till dawn, cleaning by morning, oiling and trimming by afternoon. It was a life of repetition, but it was also a life of vigilance without pause. The keeper rarely considered the lantern his possession. It was rather his master. He served it with obedience, and in return it gave him a reason for his isolation. Without it, his life would have been only stone, sea, and silence. With it, he bore responsibility that tied him to the world beyond the waves. Every sailor who saw its beam owed something to the unseen figure tending the flame. The keeper, in turn, owed everything to the lantern that demanded his sleepless attention. It is perhaps no wonder that keepers grew old before their time. The nights spent in cold air, the constant smoke of oil, the stress of watching flame and storm alike, all left their mark. Their lungs darkened with soot. Their backs bent beneath the endless stairs, their eyes reddened from staring into light. Yet they endured, because endurance was the essence of the role. The lantern had to burn, no matter the man's suffering. There were moments, however, when the burden softened into a kind of solemn beauty. On clear nights, when the stars stretched endless above, when the sea lay calm as black glass, the keeper could step back from the lamp, peer outward through the lens, and see his light cast a path across the water. It was then, perhaps, that he felt his own small place in the vast machinery of human survival. He was not merely a man alone in a tower. He was the guardian of the sea's edge, the watchman for lives he would never meet. And while the lantern never slept, in its glow he might allow himself a brief, fragile peace. The 19th century was an age before electrification reached these lonely towers. Each spark came from hand, each revolution of the lens from weight and wheel, each blaze of light from the toil of shoulders and lungs. Later generations would know automation, wires, filaments, and eventually satellites. But in that time, the light was as alive as the keeper himself, both bound in mutual dependence. Should the man falter, the lantern died. Should the lantern falter, the man's purpose vanished. Together, they survived the night. And so the story of the lighthouse was never only about stone walls or iron stairs, but about this flame that refused to close its eyes. To the world beyond the shore, it was only a light. To the keeper, it was everything, a duty, a companion, a torment, and a reason. The sea never rested. Even on days when the horizon seemed as flat and polished as a pane of glass, the keeper knew it was only a pause, never a promise. Soon enough, the wind would rise again, and with it came the waves, the rain, and the long chorus of storms that shaped every hour of his life. The lantern might have been the center of his duty, but it was the weather that tested his body and spirit. The tower stood at the mercy of the elements. Salt gales gnawed at the stone, gnashing it grain by grain. Ironwork grew slick with rust no matter how faithfully it was polished. Windows rattled against their frames, leaking water through hairline cracks, and the roof shook as if some enormous hand pressed against it. The keeper could never forget that his home, as tall and solid as it seemed, was only a narrow post clinging to the edge of a wild and endless ocean. When the wind came, it rarely whispered. It roared through the cracks and along the spiral stairs, moaning like voices in the dark. It pressed against the door so fiercely that the keeper sometimes wondered if the hinges would splinter. On certain nights, the tower seemed to lean, its weight shifting ever so slightly with each gust until he could feel the floor tilt beneath his boots. Sleep, when it came at all, was broken by these sounds. The lighthouse was a place where the walls sang with weather, and silence was rarer than thunder. The rain added its own relentless rhythm. It slapped against the glass panes of the lantern room in silver streaks, blurred the beam until it looked like little more than a pale smudge in the mist. Water found its way through the smallest fissures, dripping into corners, soaking bedding. Staining ledgers left carelessly near the windowsill. There was no escaping it. Even inside, the keeper lived in damp clothes, damp boots, damp sheets. His hands wrinkled from it, his bones ached from it, and still, every morning after such a night, he carried his bucket and rag to polish away the salt crust, to scrape away the mildew, to pretend for a moment that stone could triumph over water. But the waves were the true masters. Standing at the base of the tower, the sea hurled itself upward as though determined to claim the stones, one after another, until foam exploded against the walls in blinding spray. At high tide during a storm, water could rise high enough to strike the lower windows, leaving them opaque with streaked salt. The sound of it was like artillery, each crash of a wave a hammering blow that reverberated through the floors, up the stairs, into the very lantern room where the keeper sat with his flame. He could feel the violence of the sea in his chest, in the bones of his skull, until it seemed the entire tower quivered on the edge of collapse. On calmer days, he could step outside, boots braced against slippery stone, and look directly into the restless face of the ocean. It rolled and swelled in endless motion, green 1 hour, grey the next, black by nightfall. He learned to read it as others read books, the long lines of swells that hinted at storms forming hundreds of miles away, the sudden glassy stillness that came just before a squall broke, the white spume on the horizon that warned of winds yet unseen. In such study there was both fascination and dread. The sea offered no kindness, no apology for its moods. It was only itself, vast and unanswerable. The keeper's clothing was chosen with the sea in mind, though it was never enough. Oilskins, thick and heavy, kept some of the water out, but after hours in rain and spray, they clung to him like a second skin, soaked and heavy. Wool beneath the oilskins kept some warmth, but the smell of wet wool lingered always in the narrow rooms, a scent as constant as the salt air. Boots wore thin quickly, gloves stiffened with salt until fingers ached with cold. The damp was not something to be fought. It was something to be endured, accepted, lived with as a permanent companion. Supplies suffered as well. Flour grew clumpy with moisture. Sugar hardened into blocks. Books warped on their spines. Ink blurred on the pages of the logbook where each night's entries were recorded. Weather conditions, light hours, ships sighted. The keeper's handwriting often leaned shaky on those nights when the tower itself shook with storm. Yet he still wrote, for the record was as important as the flame, proof that the duty had been observed even when the world outside dissolved into water. There were times when storms lasted for days, when the sun never broke through, when every waking and sleeping moment blurred into the hiss of rain and the crash of waves. The keeper paced between the oil room and the lantern, muscles stiff from lack of true rest, ears ringing with the ceaseless roar. It was in such stretches that men spoke of going half mad. The monotony of danger, the same noise, the same wet, the same trembling of the floor, wore down the mind more than sudden violence ever could. And yet, there were nights when the sea's fury created a spectacle that bordered on awe. Lightning split the sky, jagged and white. illuminating the spray like shards of glass hurled into the air. The horizon vanished, replaced by a wall of water glowing ghostly in each flash. The beam of the lantern swept through it all, steady and unflinching, a pale scythe slicing across the chaos. From the lantern room, the keeper could watch this strange theatre unfold, his fragile tower defying the storm, his flame shining as the only fixed star in a universe of motion. In such moments, perhaps, he felt the reason behind all the suffering. The endless waves shaped not only his body, but his mind. He thought differently because of them. Time itself became measured by storms. He did not mark weeks or months, for one grey day blended into the next. But he remembered the great gales, the one that stripped the paint from the door, the one that shattered a pane of glass, the one that nearly tore loose the iron rail on the gallery. These became the milestones of his memory, the calendar by which his life was recorded. There were quieter moods too. After the violence, when the sea finally calmed, it lay stretched in exhausted silence, heaving only faintly as though even the waves needed sleep. The air cleared. Stars appeared, sharp and innumerable. The keeper could step onto the gallery and hear, for the first time in days, nothing more than the faint lapping of water below. His ears, battered by the roar, almost rang with the absence of sound. Such moments of stillness were rare and therefore precious. They offered a kind of fragile grace, reminding him that the sea was not only fury, but also vastness, depth, mystery. In all this, he was never separate from the wind, rain, and waves. They were not outside forces pressing against him. They were the environment itself, the very condition of his existence. To live in a lighthouse in the 19th century was to surrender to the elements, to admit their supremacy, and to endure them day after day, year after year. The keeper might tend the lantern, but it was the sea that truly kept him. The lantern's steady glow met the endless weather head-on, a single human promise against the chaos of nature. And within the tower, wrapped in oilskins and salt, the keeper kept his silent vigil, knowing that tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, the wind, the rain, and the waves would return again. Life in the lighthouse was never measured in days as most people knew them. It was not marked by bells, clocks, or church chimes, but by the unbroken cycle of tending to the flame. A keeper's time was bound to the lantern and to the oil that fed it. The rhythm of existence became not morning, noon, and night, but filling, trimming, polishing, lighting, extinguishing, and cleaning. The rituals were as fixed as the tides and as unyielding. From the first hour of waking, the keeper's mind was already on the lantern. If dawn had brought calm skies, he might have slept a little longer, but never too long. The lamp above had been extinguished only an hour or two before, and already soot clung to its chimney and dust dulled the lens. The day began with cleaning. No task could be postponed, for even a smudge of residue would scatter the light come evening. He carried rags and brushes, climbed the stairs, and set to work with quiet, methodical patience. Every inch of glass had to gleam. Every brass fitting had to shine. The tools of this cleaning were simple: cloths, polish, buckets of fresh water hauled laboriously up the tower. But the labour was relentless. It was not enough to wipe away the obvious stains. The keeper leaned close, breathing the faint scent of oil and ash, searching for the smallest streak or smudge that might dull the clarity of the lens. He polished until his own reflection swam across the glass, distorted by the great, concentric rings of the Fresnel. It was work that would be undone again by nightfall, yet it had to be done each morning all the same. After the glass came the metal, brass lamp parts, copper reservoirs, the delicate mechanism that turned the lens by slow and steady motion. All needed attention. Salt air clung to everything, and rust crept in like an uninvited guest. The keeper rubbed at bolts and hinges until they gleamed in the lantern light. He wound the clockwork weights, checked the chains, tested the balance of gears. One missed detail could mean a jam in the night, a frozen lens, a light that no longer swept across the horizon. Below, in the oil room, another ritual waited. The lighthouse smelled always of oil, sharp, acrid, clinging to clothes and skin. Gallons were stored in heavy containers, lined up like soldiers in narrow racks. Some lighthouses still used whale oil in the early part of the century, thick and greasy, drawn from the blubber of creatures hunted across oceans. Later, vegetable oils were tried, and eventually kerosene became the standard, its smell harsher, but its flame steadier. Whatever the fuel, it was the keeper's burden to manage it carefully. He measured out reservoirs for the night, filled the lamps with steady hands, wiped away every drop of spillage. An overturned can, a stray spark, and the entire tower could be lost to flame. There was an art to trimming wicks as well. Scissors designed for the task were kept sharp and clean, their edges curved to shape the wick into the perfect form. If cut unevenly, the flame would smoke, leaving soot to cloud the glass. If cut too short, it would gutter and threaten to die. The keeper trimmed with the delicacy of a surgeon, shaping the blackened ends into neat arcs, testing each piece with his eye before setting it back into place. It was a small act, but one on which the safety of passing ships depended. Meals fit themselves around these tasks. A keeper might boil coffee, fry salted pork, or slice hard bread, but even as he chewed, his thoughts remained on the lamp. Was the oil measured? Was the wick ready? Had the chimney been properly scrubbed? There was no separation between living and labor. Even rest was colored by the awareness that dusk would come again soon, and with it, the responsibility of light. The hours between morning and evening often seemed endless, yet they were filled with small duties, each tied to the ritual of the lamp. The keeper might mend oilskins, patch leaking boots, or write in his logbook. He might descend to the storehouse to inspect provisions, making notes of dwindling flour or sugar, calculating how long before the supply boat would return. But each task led back to the same inevitable point, the moment when the match struck flame against wick and the light began its nightly vigil. As the sun sank low, the ritual sharpened into focus. The keeper climbed once more to the lantern room, carrying oil if needed, steadying himself against the iron rail of the spiral stair. He checked the windings of the clockwork, set the gears into motion, and listened to the faint, patient tick of machinery beginning its long turn. Then, when the last glow of day surrendered to the edge of night, he lit the wick. A tiny flicker, then a growing flame, caught by the great lens, stretched into beams of white fire sweeping across the sea. That instant, the transformation of match to brilliance, was the core of his existence. From that moment until dawn, vigilance resumed. The keeper could never light the lamp and walk away. He remained near, eyes fixed on the flame, ears attuned to the soft hiss of burning oil. Every hour, he trimmed the wick again, catching the faint char before it spoiled the flame. Every few hours, he refilled reservoirs, wiping his hands on rags that grew permanently stained with oil. He adjusted vents to manage smoke, polished glass if mist or soot dulled its glow, and wound the mechanism that rotated the lens. Time passed not by clock hands, but by these repeated gestures, each one part of the nightly ritual. There was monotony, yes, but monotony was safety. The sameness of each act meant the flame endured, meant ships found their way past rocks and shoals. A single lapse, a single hour of carelessness could undo all. Thus, the keeper surrendered himself to repetition willingly, almost devoutly, as though each stroke of the rag, each snip of the wick, each winding of the gears were prayers to the sea for mercy. Even when storms came, when rain battered the glass and wind shook the tower, the ritual did not change. It only grew more urgent. The wick demanded trimming more often. The flame threatened to smoke or falter. The keeper's hands trembled with cold, yet they still performed the same motions, over and over, steadying the light against nature's rage. In such hours, the rituals were no longer mere routine. They were survival itself. By dawn, when the flame was finally extinguished, the cycle turned back to its beginning. The keeper wiped soot from the chimney, polished glass until it caught the first rays of morning, and set everything in readiness once again. He might then collapse into his bunk, boots still damp, eyes heavy, but sleep was never deep. Soon enough, the day would ask for cleaning, oiling, trimming, and preparing anew. And so the keeper lived not in days or weeks, but in endless revolutions of light and oil. It was a rhythm as old as the sea itself, a monotony that wore down body and spirit, yet also bound him to purpose. The ritual was his life. Without it, there was only silence and water. With it, there was a flame that cut across the night, steady as breath, tireless as the sea. Food in a lighthouse was not only sustenance, it was punctuation in a day that otherwise stretched like a single, unbroken thread of labor and silence. 3 times, perhaps 4 if there was time or appetite, the keeper sat at a rough wooden table, usually by a narrow window framed in salt-streaked glass, and ate whatever the ocean and the land had allowed him to keep. The sea was the clock, the storm was the company, and the meal was the only interruption in a pattern of endless tending to flame and structure. The table itself was often nothing more than a plank balanced on legs uneven from damp wood, scarred by knife marks and rings left by kettles set down too quickly. It was rarely polished, rarely tidy, for there was always sand in the cracks of the floorboards, and always salt creeping into the room, no matter how tightly the shutters were closed. A lantern might burn nearby in the darker months, its glow turning bowls of broth into little pools of reflected light. The food was simple because it had to be. The keeper could not walk into a market, nor could he count on steady deliveries, especially when the sea decided otherwise. A supply boat might not arrive for weeks if storms kept it away. Barrels and sacks stored in the cellar or pantry became the lifeline. Flour, dried peas, salted pork, hard biscuits, perhaps some pickled vegetables if the last shipment had been generous. When the morning came, after the long hours of checking the light and tending to its mechanism, breakfast was often nothing more than bread, soaked in tea or coffee if such luxuries had been sent. Many keepers swore by porridge, the kind that thickened so much overnight, it had to be cut into slabs the next morning and reheated with a bit of water. It was heavy, it was dull, but it filled the stomach against the labor ahead. During calmer stretches, when gardens could be planted in the thin strip of soil near shore, or when hens could be kept, eggs might appear at the table. A tomato or onion brought brightness to the otherwise muted colors of salted meat and dried beans. But those were not daily comforts. More often, the keeper learned to be inventive with the little he had. A stew could be stretched for 3 or 4 days, its flavor deepening until the last ladle felt more sea-scented than the first. And always there was the sound. Eating by the window of storms meant the sea was never quiet. Even on days of still air, there was a thrum of waves against rock, the hiss of foam retreating through channels carved by centuries. When gales struck, the window rattled, the glass quivered in its frame, and spray struck hard enough to run in thin streams down the outside wall. To sit and eat under such conditions was to feel very small indeed. Meals took on a strange rhythm not of hunger, but of duty. The keeper could not simply eat when he pleased. The light came first, always. If oil needed topping up, if wicks needed trimming, food waited. If the storm outside demanded constant checking of shutters or ropes, the stew grew cold on the table until it could be reheated. Warmth was secondary to responsibility, yet the act of eating was a ritual in itself, almost sacred in its ordinariness. The spoon dipped again and again, the bread tore slowly, the knife cut with deliberate patience. Alone at the table, a keeper might chew slowly not because of taste, but because there was nowhere else to go. The meal was an anchor, one of the few moments where body and mind could pretend to rest. Many keepers wrote in their logbooks about their meals, not because they were remarkable, but because they were the only thing that broke the monotony worth noting. Boiled potatoes with salt pork, rain heavy, or biscuits hard, sea from the east, light steady. In these sparse sentences, the weight of solitude revealed itself. Food and weather recorded side by side, the two constants in a life reduced to repetition. Storms made eating into both a comfort and a test. Imagine lifting a spoon to your mouth while the entire tower groaned under the assault of wind. The broth trembled in its bowl, sometimes sloshing onto the table before it could be carried to the lips. Bread grew damp if the shutters had been opened at the wrong time. There was no comfort in the storm, only endurance, and the meal was part of that endurance. To chew was to resist the howl of the elements pressing against the fragile walls. When keepers were not alone, when families shared the lighthouse with them, meals became the rare moment of togetherness. Children gathered at the table, their chatter filling the air in contrast to the mechanical silence of gears and lamps. A wife might ladle stew, reminding the keeper that his duties did not make him separate from the domestic world, even here at the edge of civilization. In such moments, laughter might rise above the roar of wind, if only briefly, but even then the keeper's ear remained attuned to the sea, always half listening for change. Meals also became a means of measuring time itself. The days blurred, light tending, oil filling, log entries, checks of the horizon, but the meals gave shape. Morning bread, midday broth, evening stew. A pattern so ingrained it was almost more reliable than the keeper's watch. The clock might rust or drift, but hunger came like tide, unerring. Preservation of food was an endless concern. Salt was the ally, sometimes too much so. Meat packed in brine was tough, requiring long boiling, and biscuits baked hard enough to crack a tooth were softened only by soaking in tea or stew. Pickles offered acidity, a rare sharpness to cut through the monotony. In winter, when ice clung to the rocks and storms stretched for weeks, the food became progressively duller, grayer, more of a duty than a pleasure. Yet the keeper ate, because the body must carry on even when the spirit longed for variety. The window beside the table was never truly silent. It framed not only the sea but the keeper's relationship to it. To look up from a plate and see spray dash against stone was to remember why he was here. Every wave threatened a ship, and every meal eaten in relative safety was tethered to the knowledge that others were not so fortunate. Perhaps that is why meals, however humble, carried an unspoken weight. To sit and eat was to acknowledge survival. There were rare luxuries. A fruitcake sent from shore at Christmas, dense with raisins and spice, might be sliced carefully, each piece treasured over weeks. A jar of molasses could sweeten porridge and transform a grey meal into something memorable. But such gifts were temporary. The rhythm always returned to bread, beans, pork, potatoes. The sea was not generous, and the supply boat not always timely. Some keepers learned to fish when weather allowed, casting lines from the rocks or lowering nets in calmer waters. A fresh catch was a feast beyond measure. Fried in fat, the flesh flaked tenderly, the taste of the sea made edible in a way salted barrels never could achieve. Yet fishing was uncertain, and storms often denied the chance. Still, on rare calm days, the scent of frying fish drifted up the tower, mingling with oil and salt air, creating a memory that lingered long after. Eating in a lighthouse was not private in the way it might seem. The sea was always intruding, watching. The wind pushed against the shutters, rattled the cutlery, reminded the keeper with every bite that he was never far from danger. Even chewing bread felt at times like defiance, an insistence that life continued no matter what the weather declared. The keeper often cleared his plate slowly, not because of fullness, but because he knew once the spoon was laid down, the endless duties resumed. The meal, humble as it was, became a kind of pause button, a fragile illusion of rest. When the bowl was empty and the last crust gone, the chair pushed back, the logbook awaited, and the light demanded tending once again. And so meals by the window of storms became not about flavor or variety, but about rhythm, survival, and the strange companionship of the sea. Each spoonful was a reminder of endurance. Each sip of tea was a mark of passing time. The table, rough and scarred, was the stage where the keeper's humanity quietly persisted, no matter how loud the wind or how endless the waves. If meals marked the passing of the day, then letters marked the passing of the seasons. The keeper's table, so often bare but for bread and broth, became a stage for the slow drama of communication across impossible distances. A folded sheet of paper, carried by ship and cart in hand, was more precious than coins, more sustaining than any supply barrel. To receive a letter was to be momentarily tethered to the world beyond the horizon, to remember that life went on elsewhere in laughter and sorrow, while here the waves still beat against stone. The isolation of the lighthouse made every word feel magnified. In towns, letters piled up in post offices, dropped daily into households, answered with brisk replies. But here, the sea delayed everything. Mail was not delivered on schedule. It was delivered when weather and circumstance allowed. Weeks might pass without a word. Sometimes months stretched into a season, the paper yellowing in the pocket of a sailor waiting for a chance to reach shore. By the time it reached the keeper, the ink was already a relic of another time. A child described a birthday already forgotten. A neighbor spoke of a harvest already eaten. A friend mentioned illness that might by then be long resolved, or not at all. The arrival of mail often coincided with the supply boat, a battered craft heaving toward the rocks with crates of flour, salted meat, and lamp oil, and tucked between the practical bundles, the keeper's letter, creased, smudged, handled by so many strangers that it carried not only words, but the journey itself. Before opening it, he could already see the life it had traveled, the scuff of boots on deck, the damp of mist clinging to its corner, the faint smell of tar or fish pressed into its fibers. When the seal broke and the sheet unfolded, the world rushed in. A wife's handwriting, curved and deliberate, described the children's lessons, the stubbornness of a cow, the small triumph of stitching a quilt before winter. A brother's letter spoke of storms that toppled fences, of a neighbor lost at sea, of local news that in town was commonplace, but here was treasure. A parent's shaky script might tell of aching joint, of prayers said daily for safety, of the unchanging cycle of the village church bells. Each word bridged distance, though by the time it was read, the moment it described had already vanished. Reading such letters was not quick. The keeper lingered over each line, drawing them out like a ration of sugar, reluctant to reach the end. He might read them aloud to himself, letting the sound of a familiar voice echo in the solitude. He might fold them carefully, place them back in their envelope, then hours later, reopen them again, unwilling to let the connection fade too soon. The letter lived not as a single reading, but as a companion for weeks, even months, until the next one arrived. There was an ache in these letters too, a reminder of distance, of absence. Joyful news brought happiness shadowed by helplessness. He could not attend the wedding described, could not hold the newborn mentioned, could not walk in the fields whose harvest was praised. Even sorrow became strange when it arrived belatedly. To weep for someone gone months before felt hollow, as though the grief itself were out of time. The keeper bore it quietly, knowing the sea permitted no indulgence in despair. Writing letters was its own ritual, a sheet of paper, rare and valued, laid on the table by the storm-tossed window, the ink thick and sometimes blotted by the tremor of wind shaking the tower. The keeper's handwriting was steady from years of logbooks, but his words often faltered. What could he say of life here? That the light burned steadily, that storms passed, that duties were performed. He wanted to say more, but solitude left little room for variety. His letters became mirrors of his log entries, weather, condition of the light, a mention of meals. Yet within these plain words lay affection, expressed in the hope that his family would read between the lines and hear his steady endurance as devotion. The wait between sending and receiving was the cruelest measure of time. A letter written in January might not bring its reply until March or April. By then, what he had written no longer mattered except as proof of his hand, moving across paper in the silence. Letters became less about content and more about evidence of existence. Proof that he still lived, that he still remembered, that the isolation had not severed the bond entirely. Sometimes the sea swallowed letters. A boat lost to storm meant parcels and papers sank beyond recovery. Families on shore, receiving nothing, feared the worst. Keepers waited months for a letter that had in fact been written but never arrived. Absence of words became its own kind of message, heavy with uncertainty. The silence of the post was often more haunting than the howl of the wind. Among keepers, letters were often shared, passed between isolated stations if chance allowed, carried like secret cargo from one rocky post to another. They were not just personal, they were communal reminders of the world. A newspaper scrap tucked in a parcel, an almanac folded into an envelope, gave a glimpse of events far beyond the lighthouse. Wars declared, leaders elected, inventions unveiled, all reached the keeper months after they had reshaped the world elsewhere. By the time he knew, the moment had already slipped into history. Yet this delay gave letters a peculiar stillness. They were freed from the urgency of news. Reading of an event long past, the keeper did not feel compelled to react, but only to reflect. The words had aged into something almost timeless, like shells washed smooth by waves. In that way, the lighthouse was not only a place of isolation, but also a place where the world itself arrived softened, slowed, already filtered through distance and delay. The letters, when not read, were kept carefully. Some were tucked into the logbook, pressed between pages where inked records of storms and lantern oil mingled with handwriting from home. Others were tied with string, stored in a small wooden box that travelled with the keeper from posting to posting. Over years, the bundle grew thicker, the paper more fragile, until the letters themselves became artifacts of a life lived at the edge of land and sea. There were times, of course, when no letters came at all. Months of silence stretched into nearly a year, especially in harsher postings far from busy ports. In those times, the keeper learned to carry imagined voices in his mind, to hear the laughter of children or the steady voice of a wife, as though they were spoken aloud. He might recall old letters word for word, replaying them as if they were new. Memory became a substitute for correspondence, and imagination a poor but necessary comfort. When at last a letter did come, after such stretches, it was almost overwhelming. The keeper might sit staring at it for long minutes before opening, reluctant to break the fragile anticipation. When he did, the world rushed back in, but in a way that felt almost dreamlike. To read of life continuing in kitchens and fields, in schools and markets, while he remained fixed here between waves and light, was to be reminded of how far apart his existence was from the rest of humanity. The act of holding the letter, creased, smudged, fragile, was itself grounding. It was proof that someone had touched this same page, thought of him while writing it, sealed it with care, and sent it across distances for no reason other than love or duty. The letter was more than paper and ink. It was presence, carried through absence. And when the meal was finished, when the storm rattled the window again, when the lantern awaited tending, the keeper folded the letter neatly, placed it where he could reach for it later, and carried on. The sea was endless, the duties unchanging, but for a moment, through words that had travelled months, he was not alone. Sound carried differently at sea. It was not only noise, but warning, signal, and lifeline, stretched across fog and darkness where sight failed. For the lighthouse keeper, who lived in the company of silence broken only by wind and water, the strike of a bell or the mournful cry of a foghorn was more than an intrusion. It was the voice of the shore speaking into the void. The sea, generous with storms and mystery, could be cruel in its concealment. Fog rolled in without warning, swallowing the horizon in a pale, heavy curtain. It clung to the stone walls, seeped under doors, dampened clothes, and muted vision, until even the nearest rocks seemed to vanish. For ships, fog was more feared than gales. A storm could be seen, heard, and braced for. Fog was invisible peril, silent, patient, and without end. It was in those hours that bells became the keeper's companions. Many lighthouses were equipped with great bronze fog bells, mounted on frames near the tower's base. Their tone carried outward over the water. Some were rung by hand in earlier decades, the keeper swinging the hammer steadily for hours at a time, his arm aching as he struck the pattern again and again. Later, mechanical systems were devised, weights, levers, and clockwork machinery that could strike the bell at regular intervals. Yet even then, the keeper was never free from it. He wound the mechanism, adjusted the timing, ensured the sound carried. The rhythm of the bell became the rhythm of his watch. Each strike rang heavy, slow, and deliberate, its echo folding into the mist. To sailors straining their ears at the helm of unseen vessels, it was a measure of safety, a signal of hazard, and a guide towards light they could not yet see. For the keeper, the bell was both burden and reassurance. Burden because it demanded constant vigilance, reassurance because each toll meant he had done his part to keep unseen lives from ruin. But bells, for all their weight, had limits. In strong wind, their sound was carried away, broken into fragments. In the vast expanse of sea, they reached only so far. It was this limitation that gave rise to the foghorn, a device whose voice was deeper, more commanding, and far-reaching. The earliest fog signals were crude, guns fired at intervals, the blast rolling across the water like thunder. Powder had to be stored, loaded, ignited. The noise was sudden and violent, startling not only to ships but to the keepers themselves. Soon came trumpets and reed instruments, blown by hand or by machinery, producing tones that were steadier but still strained. Finally, the foghorn evolved into great mechanical beasts, engines that compressed air and forced it through resonators, creating a blast that could shudder the very stones of the tower. When sounded, the horn shook through the keeper's chest. It was not merely heard, but felt, a low vibration that lingered in the bones long after the note faded. Its call was mournful, drawn out, almost human in its sorrow, as though the sea itself had found a voice to lament its hunger. Some said the foghorn could drive men half mad, its unrelenting cry echoing night after night during long seasons of fog. Yet for all its oppressive weight, it was vital. A single blast could cut through miles of mist where light could not penetrate. It reached ships otherwise blind, warning them of shoals, rocks, and the lighthouse's own precarious perch. The duty of tending these signals fell entirely to the keeper. He was engineer and musician both, winding mechanisms, fueling engines, adjusting timing, and ensuring that every stroke of the bell, every cry of the horn, matched the precise intervals prescribed by maritime authorities. Each lighthouse was assigned a distinct pattern, a signature sound that marked its identity to sailors. Just as each light had its own rhythm of flashes, so each fog signal spoke in its own cadence. To a trained ear, a ship's officer could distinguish where he was not by sight, but by sound, even in the densest night. Inside the tower, these sounds were inescapable. The bell, when struck, sent vibrations up the stone, through the iron stairs, and into the very floor where the keeper slept. The foghorn, louder still, could rattle glass panes and cause plates to tremble on shelves. Silence became a stranger during those hours. Even rest was filled with echoes, the sounds weaving into dreams. Keepers wrote in their logs of nights when the horn seemed endless, filling every thought until they could not tell whether it was still blowing or only haunting their minds. Yet there was a curious comfort in it too. For in those hours when the sea seemed intent on erasing the world, the bell and horn asserted human presence. They were proof of endurance, voices raised against the swallowing fog. To the keeper, tending them was not drudgery alone. It was a form of speaking, of calling out into the dark where unseen ears might be listening. He could not know which ships heard his signal, which captains altered course, which lives were spared. But he knew the sound went out, unwavering, because he made it so. There was an artistry to the machinery, gears turning, levers falling, pistons pumping air, all in steady cycles. The keeper, in his lonely watch, learned to read these rhythms like music. A bell slightly off-timed was as noticeable to him as a discordant note to a musician. A horn's blast that faltered in length was a fault demanding correction. His ear was trained not to beauty, but to precision. Sound became his craft. When weather cleared and fog lifted, The sudden absence of sound was almost startling. Silence returned, broken only by gulls and waves, and the keeper found himself listening for bells and horns that were no longer required. The tower seemed emptier without them, the sea wider, the nights more hollow. After long stretches of fog, quiet could feel heavier than noise. Villagers on the shore sometimes complained of the horns, their mournful cries drifting miles inland. To them, it was an intrusion on sleep, a constant reminder of the coast's dangers. But for sailors, it was salvation, and for the keeper, it was the language of duty. He accepted the sound's relentlessness as one accepts the tide, inevitable, necessary, and larger than himself. There were stories, whispered among mariners, of ships that survived only because they heard the signal in time, turning away from rocks at the final moment. There were also stories of those who heard nothing, whose wrecks washed ashore with no survivors. The keeper lived between these tales, never knowing which belonged to him. His work was unseen, his sound heard only at a distance, his impact guessed at but rarely confirmed. That was the strange burden of the lighthouse, to serve lives that passed unseen, to cry warnings to men whose faces he would never know. The bell, the horn, the ceaseless signals, all were reminders that the sea was never fully tamed. Light guided when skies were clear, but when the world vanished into grey, sound became the only thread between survival and loss. And so the keeper wound the clockwork, fueled the engine, and listened to the tower's own voice cry out again and again into the formless mist. As days bled into nights and nights into weeks, the sound became part of him. The mournful horn, the measured bell, they were as constant as the waves, as inevitable as the turn of seasons. When he lay in his bunk, eyes closed, he could still hear them, even in sleep. They lingered in his mind, tolling and wailing, until the line between the sea's voice and his own thoughts dissolved. And in this way, the keeper's world was never silent. It was filled with signals meant not for him but for others, a chorus of warnings that stitched his lonely tower into the great fabric of human survival. Bells struck, horns cried, and he remained their guardian, listening always, knowing that though unseen, someone out there was listening back. The lamps burned low, trimmed carefully so that the flame would last until dawn. Outside, the sea lay in shadow, its shifting surface barely catching the faintest glimmer of starlight between passing clouds. In the lantern room, the slow rotation of the great glass prisms gave off a rhythmic shimmer, sweeping out across the water, announcing the presence of the lighthouse like a heartbeat in the dark. Below, the keeper descended the spiral stairs, the soles of his boots scuffing against the stone. The night had settled into its long stillness. For many, the night promised rest. In small fishing villages along the coast, shutters closed, hearths burned down to embers, and families sank into sleep. But in the tower, rest was never simple. The keeper's duty lingered even when the work of trimming and tending the lamp was complete. Nights became stretches of silence in which the mind wandered unchecked. The body sat, but the thoughts refused to sit still. Silence in a lighthouse was not the same as silence in a cottage or farmhouse. It was deeper, more isolating, and strangely louder in its way. The thick stone walls muffled most sounds, except the crash of the sea, the moan of wind when it pressed against the glass, and the occasional cry of a gull that had not yet settled on some rock for the night. Inside, the hush magnified every movement. The creak of a chair, the rattle of a spoon in a tin mug, the faint hiss of the lamp flame carried with a presence that felt heavier than the sound itself. In that stillness, the keeper would often find himself listening for things that were not there. A knock at the door that never came, a footstep on the stair when no one climbed it, the echo of his own thoughts, growing louder as the hours stretched on. It was in these hours that the mind, no longer occupied by hauling oil or polishing brass, turned inward. Memories surfaced uninvited. Questions appeared without answers. The silence, far from soothing, pressed in like a weight. Some keepers admitted, in letters that survive, that they dreaded the long nights more than the fiercest storm. A storm brought action, ropes to secure, lanterns to check, windows to fasten, nerves tested by nature's fury. But silence allowed too much room for thought. There were men who sat at the small wooden tables in their quarters, staring at half-written letters, unable to decide what to say to loved ones they would not see for months. Others turned to prayer, their whispered words rising into the dark, mingling with the distant sound of waves. Some simply paced the length of the narrow room, back and forth, until dawn lightened the horizon. What was it that haunted these nights? Often, it was the simple ache of distance. A wife and children in a village across the bay, an aging parent left in another town, a friend buried months ago whose grave the keeper could not visit. The sea was not cruel in the ordinary way. Its cruelty lay in its endlessness, its refusal to yield to human longing. One could not walk across it. One could not command it to shrink so that letters arrived sooner or family visits became frequent. The distance was absolute, and the silence reminded the keeper of it with every hour. There were also the thoughts that belonged to the work itself. What if the lamp failed? What if a storm came and the glass shattered? What if a ship passed unseen in fog and broke upon the rocks? A keeper could follow every instruction, keep every wick trimmed, and still live with the unshakable knowledge that lives at sea depended on his unceasing attention. And so, even in still nights, with no storm on the horizon, he would rise again from bed to climb the stairs, checking the flame, listening to the mechanism of the turning lens. All was well, but his heart settled only briefly before the silence unsettled it again. There were stories told among lighthouse families of men who became eccentric from such nights. One keeper was said to spend hours speaking aloud to the walls as if they might answer back. Another carved long lines of poetry into driftwood, stacking them in piles that filled his quarters. Some whittled endless shapes from scraps of wood, sailboats, birds, towers, leaving behind drawers full of them. It was not madness, not quite, but the human mind resisting the vacuum of silence, reaching out for distraction. Even the body itself responded to the restless thought. Sleep was shallow, broken by the need to rise and check the lamp. A man might close his eyes only to dream of storms that were not real, waking with a start to the same unbroken quiet. His hands itched for work, but there was none to do until morning. And so he sat, often with a journal, a Bible, or the steady occupation of mending a garment by lamplight. The silence made even the smallest task feel heavy, as though every stitch or word written was an attempt to push back the emptiness. And yet, curiously, there was also a strange peace to be found in these nights. Some keepers wrote of how the long hours taught them to notice what others ignored, the subtle change of the sea's rhythm when the tide shifted, the faint arc of constellations moving across the glass dome above, the way the lighthouse itself seemed to breathe with its turning light. Silence, when endured long enough, became its own kind of teacher. It revealed how small a man was against the ocean, and how steady he must become to withstand it. There were moments when the keeper, sitting alone, would hear nothing but his own breathing and feel that he was, in that instant, the only soul awake in the world. A curious loneliness, but also a curious privilege. Few men ever experienced a night so untouched by human noise. Few ever knew what it was to sit in the narrow band between land and sea, watching over strangers' lives with nothing but flame and patience. The silence, while restless, reminded him that his watch mattered. Without it, the night belonged entirely to the dark. Some nights stretched longer than others. In winter, when the daylight shrank, the hours of solitude seemed endless. Darkness fell before supper and did not lift until breakfast. The keeper could measure his wakefulness by the logs in the stove, burning down one after another, by the slow movement of shadows across the wall, by the cold that crept deeper as the night wore on. In those seasons, rest was often no more than short intervals between wakeful thoughts, and by dawn, the body felt as weary as it had been at dusk. On rare occasions, silence was broken in ways that startled the keeper into alertness. A distant gunshot from some unseen vessel, A bell carried faintly from another lighthouse miles away. Once, even the hollow sound of oars cutting the water, though no boat could be seen. These moments were reminders that the world beyond his watch still moved, even if unseen. But when they passed, the silence seemed heavier for their absence, as though the sea itself had drawn a deep breath and held it once more. Over time, the keeper came to know silence not as an enemy, but as a constant companion. It was not always kind, not always welcome, but it was faithful. It pressed against him on nights of restlessness, followed him through the narrow stairwells, and lingered in the rooms of the tower. In its company, he learned both the weight of thought and the strength of endurance. And so each morning, when the light of dawn broke at last, and the silence lifted with the sound of gulls, the keeper greeted the day not as a man who had slept well, but as a man who had endured another night of watchfulness. The silence never truly ended. It returned each evening with the setting sun, waiting patiently, and the keeper, weary yet steadfast, received it again, knowing that this too was part of the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen him. For in the long history of lighthouses, silence was as essential as oil, as steady as the lamp itself. It was the unseen element that shaped the men who watched the seas, leaving its quiet mark on their restless thoughts, night after night. The sea at night was never truly empty. Even when the horizon looked like nothing more than a line of black ink smeared between sky and water, there was always the sense that something moved out there. Unseen sails, drifting hulls, the low shapes of vessels struggling against the pull of tide and wind. A keeper learned to listen for them, not with his ears alone, but with a kind of instinct, as though the darkness itself carried warnings. And when the warnings proved real, when the unseen vessel became a shattered wreck upon the rocks, the keeper bore witness to the most dreaded part of his calling. Shipwrecks were not rare. The 19th century seas were crowded with merchantmen, fishing smacks, schooners and steamers. They moved constantly across coasts, carrying coal, grain, timber, passengers, sometimes fortune, sometimes nothing more than men, desperate for wages. A wrong turn, a sudden squall, a patch of fog, too thick for even the strongest lantern to pierce. And the voyage ended not at harbour, but on jagged rock beneath the spray of waves. The lighthouse existed to prevent these tragedies, yet no tower could prevent them all. From his high perch, the keeper sometimes saw the disaster begin before the sailors themselves knew. A faint light, wavering where no safe channel lay, a silhouette cutting too close to the breakers. The sickening realization that the vessel had mistaken its course. He would ring the bell or sound the horn, straining the limits of sound across water, but often the night swallowed such signals whole. And then came the sound no keeper ever forgot. The crack of timber against stone, followed by the low groan of a ship breaking apart. It was a helplessness that stung deeper than solitude. The keeper might stand with his lantern raised, shouting into the gale, but the sea claimed what it wished. Men clung to planks, cries carried faintly before the surf consumed them. Sometimes there was no cry at all, only the endless pounding of waves against what had once been a proud hull. He was there to watch, unable to reach them, the light above him shining in steady indifference. The duty of the tower was to warn, not to rescue, and that knowledge weighed heavily on those who tended it. When survivors did wash ashore, it was the keeper who became their first witness. He would stumble across the rocks with rope in hand, pulling half-drowned sailors from the surf, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the shock of survival. They clutched his coat as though it were the mast itself, the last solid thing in a world that had betrayed them. The keeper would drag them into the safety of the lighthouse kitchen, wrap them in blankets, offer hot broth if it could be made, and listen as they recounted the brief, violent undoing of their voyage. But for every survivor, there were those who did not rise from the tide. The sea gave them back reluctantly, sometimes days later, laying them along the shore, as though mocking the efforts of the light that had burned all night. Keepers buried many men they never knew, their names lost, their belongings scattered. A simple grave on a cliffside, marked only with a wooden cross or a pile of stones, was often all that could be given. Families might never learn where their sons or fathers had gone, and the keeper, standing over the shallow earth, carried their absence in silence. The memory of wrecks clung to the stones of the tower. Some claimed they could hear them afterward, the echo of voices in the wind, the thud of waves that sounded too much like fists on a hull. A keeper alone at night might imagine faces pressed against the glass, or hear footsteps in the stairwell when no one was there. These were not tales meant to frighten. They were acknowledgements of the way tragedy lingered in such lonely places. The sea did not forget, and neither did the men who kept its lights. Shipwrecks also changed the rhythm of the keeper's life in more practical ways. Salvage laws meant that wreckage washing ashore belonged to the crown or the state, but coastal communities often saw it differently. Timber, barrels, even nails and ropes were valuable. Some villagers hurried to the shore not to rescue but to gather. This created tension, for the keeper was both a witness to tragedy and a guardian of property, not his own. He might find himself pleading with neighbors to leave goods untouched, knowing that hunger often outweighed obedience. There were darker whispers too, tales of wreckers who lured ships to their deaths by moving false lights along the shore, deceiving sailors into thinking a safe harbor lay ahead. Whether these tales were true or merely superstition, they weighed heavily on men whose sole purpose was to preserve life. To imagine that others might seek the opposite was a shadow difficult to shake. For the keeper, the difference between his light and a false one was not just technical, it was moral. His flame was steady, unwavering, trustworthy, no matter how fierce the storm. When storms blew in, the fear of wrecks hung over every moment. The wind roared like a living beast, spray lashed against the lantern panes, and the sea below became a boiling mass of foam and darkness. In such conditions, a keeper could not sit still. He paced, climbed, descended, checked, adjusted, his own nerves bound tightly to the lamp's steady glow. Each crash outside might be the sound of a ship striking. Each gust of wind carried the possibility of men perishing within sight of his tower. And when morning broke, he scanned the coastline with weary eyes, searching for fragments of wood or the bodies of the drowned. Even when the sea was calm, the stories of wrecks lingered like an undertow. Every logbook carried entries of disasters: schooner lost off the point, brigantine broken on the shoals, steamer foundered in fog. The names of ships and their captains became a litany, a reminder that the sea was never truly safe. A lighthouse keeper lived with this knowledge as constantly as with the sound of waves. It was not a question of if another wreck would come, but when. And yet, amidst the sorrow, there was a strange dignity in the keeper's role. He could not prevent every loss, but his vigilance meant fewer. His light meant that countless ships passed safely, their captains steering away from danger without ever knowing the man who had trimmed the wick and polished the glass. The wrecks stood as grim reminders of failure, but the silence of safe voyages, ships unseen, lives unlost, was the greater measure of his labor. There were moments, too, when survival felt miraculous. A single fisherman clinging to wreckage, hauled ashore alive against all odds. A schooner that struck but held together long enough for her crew to scramble to land. These moments offered the keeper a fragile reassurance that his work was not in vain. Even as black water claimed many, it spared some. And he, with his steady flame and sleepless watch, was part of that fragile bargain between sea and man. In time, shipwrecks became part of the keeper's inner landscape, as much as the sound of the wind or the smell of lamp oil. He no longer recoiled at their sight, though he never grew indifferent. They were woven into the fabric of his life, shaping the way he looked at the sea, at the lantern, at the long nights of solitude. For him, the black water was never just water. It was memory, warning, burden, and purpose. And so each night, when he climbed the spiral stair and stood before the great lens, he lit the lamp with hands that carried the weight of all he had seen. The light reached out, piercing the dark, a promise made again and again, that though the sea might take, it would never take without warning. It was not victory, not salvation, but it was the one gift a keeper could give to those who braved the black water. Salt was the silent enemy of every lighthouse. The sea never stopped reaching upward, not only with spray flung by the wind, but with an invisible mist that clung to every surface. Day after day, it settled on stone, wood, and iron, leaving behind a thin crust that ate away at anything made by human hands. To keep a lighthouse standing against such persistence was a task as endless as tending the lantern itself. For the keeper, maintenance was not occasional work, it was a way of life. Rust appeared first in the railings that circled the gallery. Those iron bars, meant to keep a man from falling to the rocks below, were constantly exposed to wind and wave. They turned from black to red, flaking at the touch, as though the sea had set fire to them in slow motion. The keeper carried a wire brush and scraped until his knuckles ached, clearing the surface until bare metal showed through. Then came the thick paint, applied in patient strokes, layer upon layer, until the barrier gleamed again. Yet he knew that within weeks the salt would return, creeping under the paint, beginning the cycle anew. Inside, the same battle unfolded on a smaller scale. Hinges squeaked, bolts corroded, tools left too long in damp corners became useless lumps. Even the great iron stairs spiraling upward through the tower needed constant vigilance. A loose step could mean disaster, and so the keeper tapped each one with the heel of his boot, listening for hollowness, stopping to tighten or replace where needed. There was no end to such work. The sea was patient, and so the keeper had to be more patient still. Stone, though less fragile, bore its own scars. The blocks of granite or brick that formed the tower's body were not immune to salt and storm. Hairline cracks appeared, widening with each freeze and thaw of winter. Rainwater seeped in, carrying salt deeper, eating away at mortar until the seams weakened. The keeper mixed lime and sand, kneeling on scaffolds high above the surf, patching with careful hands while the wind tugged at his coat. To outsiders, the tower looked unchanging, but he knew every crevice, every scar, every place where the sea had pressed too hard. Wood was no safer. Doors swelled in dampness, their frames warped so badly they had to be forced open with a shoulder. Window shutters rotted, and planks in the keeper's quarters warped until they creaked with each step. Salt drew moisture to the surface, and with moisture came decay. Buckets of pitch and barrels of tar stood ready, their sharp smell lingering in the air, used to coat wood in the hope of holding back the inevitable. It was sticky work, black stains that clung to skin long after the day was done. But it bought time, and in a lighthouse time was everything. The lantern itself demanded the most delicate care. The glass panes grew cloudy with salt, a fine film that dulled the light until it no longer cut cleanly across the water. The keeper polished them with rags dipped in vinegar, rubbing until the surface shone, careful never to scratch the glass. The great lens, with its intricate prisms, required even more attention. Dust, smoke, and salt crystals found their way into every angle, and a single smudge could scatter the beam. He worked slowly, breathing lightly, as though touching a sacred object. To damage the lens was unthinkable. It was the very heart of the tower. Tools themselves were a kind of lifeline. Hammers, chisels, files, brushes, all needed constant care. Left unattended, they would rust before the week was out. The keeper wiped each one after use, oiled the joints, and stored them carefully. Still, more than once, he had reached for a tool only to find it ruined, eaten away in silence. Nothing in a lighthouse could be taken for granted. Every object had to be guarded against the slow, relentless advance of the sea. There were days devoted entirely to repair, when the work of tending the light receded behind the work of keeping the tower itself alive. The keeper might rise early, set a pot of porridge on the stove, and then spend hours chipping barnacles from the base where the waves struck hardest. He swung a mallet against stubborn crusts, water soaking his boots, spray biting his face. The barnacles would return, of course. They always did, but for a short while the stone breathed easier without their grip. Other days demanded climbing. The gallery railing needed new bolts, or the lightning rod had bent in a storm. With rope around his waist, the keeper leaned into the empty air, hammer in hand, while gulls wheeled above him. His knuckles were raw, his face streaked with salt. Yet he drove the iron into place, trusting that his weight would hold. In such moments, the tower itself seemed alive, a companion resisting the sea alongside him, needing his hands to endure. Repairs were not always solitary. When storms tore away shutters or split beams, extra hands might arrive. Carpenters, masons, laborers from a nearby village. Their voices filled the tower with a rare energy, laughter echoing in stairwells where usually there was only the keeper's solitary tread. But once the urgent work was done, they left, carrying their tools back to the world beyond the headland, and the keeper returned to his quiet, left to watch over the fresh patches of mortar and paint, knowing the sea would test them soon enough. The sound of hammering and scraping became a rhythm as familiar as the sound of waves. It was the counterpoint to the music of the sea, the human effort to hold back nature, if only for another season. Some keepers even found comfort in it. The work gave shape to the long days, broke the monotony of waiting. Each repaired hinge, each sealed crack was a small victory, a mark of defiance carved into the face of inevitability. Still, there were moments of despair. A storm could undo weeks of labor in a single night. A window mended and painted might shatter in one blast of wind. A freshly tarred door might swell until it would not close. The keeper would stand in the wreckage, water pooling on the floor, tools scattered, and feel the weight of futility pressing down. Yet he began again, because to neglect repair was to invite ruin. The tower was more than stone and iron. It was trust, duty, and the thin line between safety and disaster for every ship at sea. Salt also left its mark on the keeper himself. His clothes grew stiff with it. His boots cracked. His skin roughened until his hands were as coarse as rope. Even his lungs felt it, the air heavy with brine, making each breath taste faintly of the ocean. He lived in a world where decay was constant, and in time he carried that same weathering within his body. Yet he endured, patching both tower and self with the same steady resolve. There was a certain philosophy in this endless maintenance. To keep a lighthouse was not to preserve perfection, but to accept imperfection and fight it daily. Rust would return, wood would warp, stone would crack, yet each stroke of the brush, each strike of the hammer delayed the inevitable. It was a life of postponement, of stretching fragile endurance against the tide of entropy, and in that postponement lay meaning. When evening came, and the keeper wiped his hands clean of tar and oil, he climbed the iron stair with a body sore from labor. The lantern awaited him, needing its wick trimmed, its glass polished, its light coaxed into steadiness. He looked out across the darkening sea, the horizon smudged by mist, and knew that ships moved there, unseen. They would never know the brushstrokes on the railing, the patches of mortar, the hidden nails holding wood against the wind. They would only see the light, burning steady, never guessing how much rust and salt had been fought back to keep it so. And in that silence, surrounded by the smell of oil and brine, the keeper understood the truth of his labor. The lighthouse was not built once. It was built every day, rebuilt, with every scrape of rust and every smear of paint. It stood because he fought the sea, not with force, but with patience. Salt and rust were relentless, but so was he. And in that quiet contest, under the endless weight of sky and water, the tower endured. The days at the lighthouse often stretched on without interruption, their silence broken only by the slow roll of the sea or the creak of the lantern room above. A keeper could spend weeks in that isolation, counting time, not by hours or dates, but by the rhythm of tasks, polishing glass, tending the wick, hauling oil, scrubbing away the salt that found its way into every seam. And then, almost without warning, a sound would rise across the water, low, mechanical, and out of place against the natural voices of wind and waves. A boat. Not the ghostly outline of a distant schooner sliding past on its trade route, but a vessel making for the lighthouse itself. Rare, almost startling, these visits carried with them the weight of interruption, like a ripple across an otherwise perfectly still pond. The sight of a boat approaching could stir something unspoken in the keeper. Not excitement exactly, but a restless alertness. It meant someone else was coming into this closed world of stone, lantern, and sea. It meant voices where there had been only one, footsteps where there had been only silence. More than anything, it meant news of markets, of towns, of wars or politics that seemed impossibly far away, but still pressed their shadow on the lives of men. To a keeper, those arrivals were like sudden windows opening to another world, even if only briefly before the shutters closed again. The approach was never hurried. From the gallery, one could watch the small shape inching forward, the oars dipping in unison or a puff of black smoke from a small steamer's stack trailing against the sky. The boat cut through water flecked with sunlight or mist, its path as deliberate as the turning of the lighthouse lamp itself. Often, the keeper would stand with hands shielding his eyes, studying the figures aboard, wondering if it would be the supply boat sent by the service, or perhaps fishermen sheltering from rougher seas, or more rarely, strangers simply curious about the tower rising like a sentinel out of the waves. When the keel scraped against rock or the ropes were thrown up from below, the rhythm of life shifted. The knock of boots on the stone steps replaced the solitary echo of the keeper's own. Salt-stained men would climb, carrying crates or parcels or nothing at all, their voices carrying upward even before they reached the door. And suddenly, the air inside the tower felt different. The small quarters, with their neat bunks and simple furnishings, seemed to hold more life than they were built for. The visits of the supply boat were the most predictable, though even they did not always come on time. Bad weather could delay them for weeks, leaving the keeper to stretch what stores he had, counting carefully the dwindling sacks of flour, the tins of salted meat, the kegs of oil. When at last the boat came, its cargo was less luxury than lifeline. Barrels of kerosene were rolled up, heavy and slick with brine. Coils of rope, crates of preserved food, and occasionally a sack of letters were handed over with the formality of duty. Men exchanged brief words, practical instructions, a nod here or there, and just as quickly as they arrived, they left, the sound of oars or engine fading until once more it was only the sea. But not every boat carried supplies. Some carried visitors of a less official nature, fishermen caught in fog, their faces weathered and their clothes smelling of the day's catch. They brought with them stories in the rough dialect of their coast, tales of storms that had swallowed whole fleets, or arguments over prices at market, or gossip about a neighbour's failing health. Their words filled the air of the lighthouse with a noise that lingered even after they were gone, leaving the keeper with echoes of a world that went on ceaselessly without him. There were other visits, more unexpected still. Once in a great while, a passing ship might send a boat ashore, its passengers curious to stretch their legs or see the lighthouse up close. These were not fishermen or fellow keepers, but strangers, sometimes finely dressed, with hands unused to labour, who marvelled at the stairs winding upward and asked endless questions about the turning lamp. Their presence in the stark tower was almost jarring, their polished shoes against stone floors, their polite astonishment at the simplicity of the keeper's quarters. They would stay for an hour, perhaps less, before climbing back down and returning to the world of shipboard comforts, leaving behind only the faint impression of perfume or tobacco smoke in the cold air. For the keeper, these visits brought no lasting change. They arrived like gusts of wind, stirring the stillness, and then were gone. Yet each left behind something intangible, something folded into the quiet routine that followed. A scrap of conversation might return unbidden in the long hours of polishing brass, a glimpse of new clothing, a turn of phrase, or the brief touch of a newspaper headline might settle into the keeper's mind, giving him something to turn over in the solitude. Still, not all visits were welcome. Storms sometimes drove desperate boats toward the lighthouse, and with them came men half drowned or shivering, needing shelter more than company. The keeper, by duty and by instinct, opened his doors. Blankets were offered, fires coaxed into warmth, Wet clothes hung dripping by the stove. In those hours, the tower became less a beacon for ships than a refuge for men. And in the silence after they had left, the rooms carried the ghost of their presence. The smell of wet wool, the echo of hoarse laughter, the memory of hands reaching out for bread or drink. Perhaps the rarest of visits came not from boats at all, but from the service itself. Inspectors arriving to test, to question, to record. Their visits carried a different weight. Formality, judgment, the careful scratching of pens against paper as they noted the state of the lantern, the order of the quarters, the appearance of the keeper himself. These men came not to bring the outside world, but to measure how well the keeper had held himself apart from it. And their departure left behind not conversation or memory, but the lingering awareness of responsibility, of duty maintained beneath their watchful eyes. The rhythm of such visits could not be predicted. They might come twice in a month, or once in a season, or not at all for a year. And each time they did, the keeper's solitude was reshaped, if only briefly, for when the last figure vanished down the steps, when the ropes were untied and the boat slipped back into the swell, the silence that returned was sharper, more absolute than before. It pressed against the walls, filled the narrow rooms, and settled like a second skin over the man who remained. The memory of those rare arrivals lingered longer than the men themselves. In the evenings when the lamp was trimmed and the flame burned steady, the keeper might lean against the gallery rail, looking out over the same water that had carried them. He would think of their laughter, their questions, their hurried farewells. And though the sea stretched empty, the thought of that brief human presence lingered, a reminder that even here, at the far edge of things, the world had not forgotten him entirely. Yet as the days wore on, that reminder thinned. The sound of their voices faded, replaced once again by the hiss of surf, the whistle of wind against stone, the mechanical sweep of the lantern. Life folded back into its ordinary pattern, as seamless and inevitable as the tide. The keeper returned to his work, hands stained with oil, eyes sharp against the fog, heart settled into the rhythm of solitude. And when the faint hum of another boat came again, whether in a week, a month, or a year, it would break that rhythm anew, stirring the silence with the fragile, fleeting presence of others, before vanishing once more into the endless sea. Time in a lighthouse was never truly kept by clocks. Days and nights slipped into one another, until the very idea of a calendar seemed like something meant for a distant town, where church bells marked hours and farmers counted weeks by markets. On the rocks where a keeper lived, time bent itself around weather. The seasons did not arrive neatly on appointed dates, but came in waves of storm or stretches of silence. Life was measured not by spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but by how the sea chose to behave. The first hints of change would often be found in the air. Salt carried differently when the wind shifted. A sudden softness might drift in on a breeze, promising calmer waters ahead, or a heaviness would settle, foretelling squalls that had not yet appeared on the horizon. A keeper learned to feel these small signals. Though he rarely spoke of them aloud, they became part of his body, as natural as the beat of his own heart. Storms were not interruptions to life at the lighthouse. They were part of its steady pattern. One day might pass with skies open and seas flat, the air so still that the gulls hardly needed to move their wings. The next, clouds would pile in great dark masses, waves would rise in towers, and the air would scream with spray. Inside the tower, the keeper braced against it. Lantern glass rattled in its frame, shutters groaned, ropes whined against strain. The tower itself never yielded, but everything within seemed to bend beneath the weight of the storm. There were nights when sleep became impossible. Rain hurled itself sideways against the stone, and the great bellows of the sea struck the rocks like cannon fire. Every crash reverberated through the keeper's body, as though he were part of the building itself. He would walk the narrow spiral, checking for leaks, securing whatever might be shaken loose, keeping himself awake not just out of duty, but because the very violence of nature demanded witness. In those hours, time felt both immense and suspended, each minute stretching long and heavy, each hour indistinguishable from the last. And yet, just as suddenly as they came, storms would pass. The sea, exhausted from its own rage, sank back into itself. Skies cleared. The gulls returned to their wheeling, and the lighthouse, streaked with salt and debris, stood serene again, as though it had endured nothing more than a passing thought. In those moments of calm, the keeper felt both relief and unease. Relief, because the worst was over. Unease, because he knew it was only ever temporary. Calm was not the opposite of storm, but its companion, each forever chasing the other. Through the turning of years, the keeper came to mark the seasons by these rhythms. Summer was not a season of heat, but of long stretches when the sea lay quiet, its surface burnished by sunlight, its swells gentle enough that even small fishing boats dared venture farther out. Supplies came more regularly then, carried smoothly across open water, and the lantern's nightly sweep fell across ships gliding with full sails. Life in those weeks felt easier, though never idle, for the brass still demanded polish, the glass still needed cleaning, and the oil still had to be measured and poured. Autumn arrived, not with falling leaves, but with storms growing sharper, more sudden. The winds turned restless, and days that began in perfect calm could end in violent squalls. It was a season of uncertainty, when every horizon seemed to carry a threat. The keeper felt it in his bones, the constant readiness, the awareness that calm could be overturned in an instant. Winter was not merely cold, it was siege. Seas turned iron grey, winds came cutting and relentless, and ice clung to the very stones of the tower. The gallery rail froze beneath the keeper's hand, and the stairs became slick with frost. Days passed when the sea itself seemed too violent for any boat, and the keeper knew he would see no human face but his own for weeks at a time. Oil burned lower in those months, rations stretched further, and silence grew deeper. The storms were longer then, rolling in waves that lasted days without pause. In that season, the lighthouse felt less like a beacon and more like a fortress, holding against an endless assault of wind and water. Spring brought no sudden blossoming, no fragrant fields. It arrived in the slow loosening of the sea's grip, in days when the storms came less often, and in the faint warmth that touched the stone walls. Gulls returned in greater numbers. Fishing boats appeared again at the edges of sight, and the air seemed lighter, carrying with it hints of lands unseen. Spring was always less a beginning than a reprieve, a softening of the harsh grip that had held the keeper so tightly through the winter months. What tied all these seasons together was not the land's growth or decline, but the sea's endless shifting moods. The keeper did not speak of summers or winters, as other men did, but of calm years and storm years. He remembered when a gale had torn the shutters free in the depth of December, or when a still August had stretched into weeks without a ripple on the water. These memories were his measure of time, his record of passing years, etched not in ink, but in the scars of the building and the calluses of his own hands. Each storm left its mark. Salt crusted deeper into the stone, wood swelled and cracked, metal took on rust that demanded scraping and oiling. Repairs became part of the cycle, as inevitable as the storms themselves. Calm, too, left its traces, in the faded paint from days of endless sun, in the wear of boots across dry stairs, in the long hours when silence pressed heavier than any gale. Both shaped the life of the lighthouse, and both shaped the man who kept it. The keeper came to understand that there was no true division between these states. Storms did not end, they only paused. Calm was not a season unto itself, but the brief breath the sea took before rising again. The lighthouse was built for both, designed to endure, to stand unyielding, regardless of what the world outside chose to bring. And the keeper, in time, became much the same. His face weathered, his hands toughened, his heart adjusted to the strange rhythm of violence and peace. On quiet days, when the water shone like glass and the horizon stretched unbroken, he might walk the gallery with an ease almost foreign, his duties lightened by the absence of threat. But even then, he could never quite shake the awareness of what waited. He would look out over the calm and see, in its very stillness, the promise of its opposite. Calm was a fragile thing, always on the verge of breaking. And when the storms returned, as they always did, he stood ready, not because he welcomed them, but because he had no choice. The seasons of storms and calms were not his to command, only his to endure. And so he lived them both, again and again, measuring out his life not in months or years, but in the endless alternation of sea's fury and sea's silence. That was the true calendar of the lighthouse keeper. Storms, like great black marks. Calm, like empty pages between. And as the years wore on, he came to read his own life within it. Every scar on the stone, every rusted hinge, every faded rope a chapter in the long, quiet history of a man bound to the rhythm of the sea. Time has a way of softening the outlines of a life, as though years themselves are waves, wearing stone into smoothness until only the suggestion of shape remains. For the lighthouse keeper, whose days were measured not by clocks, but by the moods of sea and sky, this erosion of memory was almost expected. He had been living not in years or decades, but in tides, storms, and calms, until even his own reflections seemed to belong less to himself than to the tower that held him. At first, he had kept count, marks scratched in a ledger, dates noted when supply boats came, seasons tallied as storms rolled past and the quiet returned. But eventually, the tally itself felt unnecessary. The days repeated in their long, slow rhythm, so alike in their duties and silences that numbers added nothing to the weight of experience. Life became circular, the same climb up the iron stairs, the same polishing of brass, the same pouring of oil, strike of match and slow burning glow. The seasons turned, but the circle remained unbroken. In that repetition, something began to change. His face, once so alert to every distant sail and each nuance of weather, grew lined with time and salt. The sea, indifferent as ever, mirrored nothing of him back. He grew older in its presence, and yet to the sea, he was as forgettable as foam blown from a breaking wave. It was this strange contrast that gave his later years their melancholy. He had given so much to the sea, and still it carried on as though he had never been. The tower, however, remembered. The stairs wore down under his boots, the brass showed the shine of his cloth, and the walls bore faint smudges where his hands had pressed countless times. Every surface carried a trace of him. Yet even this, he knew, would fade. Another keeper would polish the brass, scrape the rust, and leave his own marks. In time, all evidence of one man's presence would vanish into the ongoing life of the lighthouse. His hair whitened like the foam at the base of the rocks. His stride slowed, though the duties never allowed him to stop entirely. Lanterns still required trimming, storms still demanded vigilance, letters still came after long delays. But where once these acts had filled him with a sense of purpose, they now seemed to press upon him with a quiet inevitability. He performed them not out of devotion, but because there was nothing else to do. The routine had become not merely duty, but existence itself. There were moments, fleeting, half forgotten, when he would pause in the gallery, staring out at the endless horizon, and wonder whether the sea remembered him at all. Ships passed, their crews perhaps catching only a glimpse of the light or a faint silhouette against the sky. To them, he was invisible, a nameless figure whose labor kept them safe. To the gulls, he was simply another inhabitant of the rocks. To the waves, he was nothing at all. It is said that isolation bends a man's thoughts inward, but for the keeper, it seemed to bend them outward instead. He found himself dissolving into the vastness, his own presence thinning against the immensity of wind and tide. He no longer thought of himself as separate from the tower, or even from the sea it guarded. He was simply part of its memory, as much a fixture as the lantern, as enduring and as fragile. The seasons continued their endless cycle. Winters pressed against him with their cold sieges. Summers stretched in long, slow calms. Storms came and went, and he endured them all with the same quiet persistence. But within, The sense of years grew weaker. He no longer recalled exactly how long he had served, nor did he care to. He felt instead that he had always been there, that his life had been absorbed into the very stones of the lighthouse. Visitors grew rarer as he aged, though on occasion a boat would still appear with supplies or news from the mainland. Faces came and went, younger men with surer steps, some in awe of the keeper's endurance, others indifferent. They would bring word of wars, elections, inventions that promised to change the world. He listened politely, nodded, but the news washed over him like distant thunder. Out here, nothing changed. The sea roared, the lantern burned, and life continued in its small, steady circle. There were times, especially on nights when the fog thickened and the horn bellowed into the endless dark, when he felt himself fading. Not in body, though that too weakened, but in memory. As though he was already becoming part of the sea's story, dissolving into it even while he still lived. He would imagine himself as a shadow moving through the stone tower, his footsteps echoing long after he was gone, blending with the hum of the lantern and the sigh of the waves. And yet, there was no bitterness in this fading. He had long since ceased to expect recognition. The sea had never promised gratitude. It had given him solitude, storms, and silence, and he had accepted them all. His life was small compared to the ocean's vastness, and in accepting that, he found a kind of peace. To be forgotten by the sea was no tragedy. It was simply the way of things. In the quietest hours, when the lantern turned above him and the air smelled faintly of oil and salt, he sometimes felt as though he were already half a ghost. The stone walls no longer seemed to resist him but absorbed him. His thoughts slowed, his movements softened, and he lived more in memory than in present time. He remembered storms of decades past, nights of silence, mornings when sunlight poured through the narrow windows. Each memory blurred with the next until the whole of his life felt like one long day, stretched endlessly across sea and sky. There is a way the world forgets those who guard it. Ships reached safe harbors, sailors returned to families, and stories were told of voyages completed. The light that guided them was rarely remembered, the keeper even less. But this forgetting did not trouble him. In his later years, he came to believe that fading into the sea's memory was the only true end for a man who had lived so long at its edge. One evening, as the horizon glowed with a weary sun setting into mist, he stood at the gallery and looked out over the vast water. The sea was calm, its surface broken only by slow, gentle swells. The lantern waited above, its light ready to sweep the darkness once more. He rested his hand on the rail, worn smooth by decades of touch, and let the wind move through his hair. He thought not of legacy, nor of history, nor of the years he had given. He thought only of the waves, their endless rhythm, the same sound he had lived with for so long, a rhythm that would outlast him, as it had outlasted countless others. The keeper faded not in a single moment, but gradually, like the tide drawing back from the shore. His steps grew slower, his days quieter, until at last he seemed to merge with the tower and the sea it guarded. The lanterns still burned, the storms still came, the calm still followed, and the sea rolled on as though nothing had changed. And perhaps nothing had. For the man who lived his life within stone walls and iron stairs, tending a lantern that never slept, had become as much a part of the sea as the rocks themselves. The keeper was gone, but the memory of his watch lingered, dissolved into the salt air, carried on the waves, and lost, at last, in the endless memory of the sea. The story drifts to its close, but the sea never really quiets. It moves as it always has, wearing down stone, carrying ships, whispering to those who stand watch. In the lighthouse, life was measured not by crowds or calendars, but by flame, salt, and silence. We've wandered together through this small world, up the spiral stairs, past the heavy walls, into nights where only the lamp kept company. You've heard the keeper's solitude, his careful rituals with oil and wick, his long waits for letters that might never arrive. You've stood with him in storms where the tower shook but did not fall. You've seen the rust creep into hinges, the waves carry wrecks to the shore, and those rare moments when a passing boat broke the silence of weeks. And through it all, there was a rhythm. Storm and calm, night and day, duty and weariness, until the keeper himself faded into the sea's memory. So as you settle into sleep tonight, I'll ask you this. What part of his world stays with you most clearly? Was it the sound of foghorns across black water, the restless nights with only the waves for company, or the way time itself seemed to bend in the silence of the tower? Let me know in the comments. These small details, when gathered, are like lights along a coastline, each one helping to keep another from drifting too far into the dark. And if this quiet journey has kept you company, I invite you to subscribe, so that the next time we wander into forgotten corners of the past, you'll be there with us. Another night, another story, another lantern burning in the distance. Until then, let the sea's rhythm carry you gently into rest.